Welcome everybody. Good morning. My name is Raul Schafranek. I work as a former verification engineer for a company called Runtime Verification. And today I'm going to present to you a new tool that we are working on right now. And it's called the Symbolic Solidity Debugger, or the short name now is Symbolic with a K at the end. So we have an agenda for this talk. First of all, I will tell you what is symbolic debugging, because that's not a well-established term. That's a term that we made up, but it captures the essence. Then, because I assume not everybody in the audience is familiar with symbolic execution, I will give you a small primer on what symbolic execution is. And the good thing here is, if you have never heard of it, then the symbolic debugger is the right tool for you. It's a tool that is built specifically to lower the entry barrier to formal methods and symbolic execution. And then we will use the debugger. I've prepared some screenshots where we will catch a bug in a kind of a real-world context. I would show some additional highlights that cannot be shown at the working example. And eventually, if we have the time at the end, I also want to go into some of the technical details and the tech stack that we used under the hood. Okay, first of all, what's symbolic debugging? It's the combination of two core technologies. The first one is debugging. Like, you probably know it. You probably used a debugger for Java or for Python, where you can set breakpoints. You can pause the execution at any time. You can inspect the variables. You can inspect the call stacks. Basically, pause at any time and inspect everything that's interesting about the current point of execution. That's debugging. So now, symbolic execution is a way of systematically exploring all the possible behaviors that a program could manifest. So in symbolic execution, you can basically leave some of the parameters, for example, the parameters of your function, you can leave them unknown, or you can leave them symbolic, as we like to say. And then if you go through the code, you just assume that you don't know anything about the variables, so you probably need to descant into different branches and make different assumptions at different points in the execution. There's a super cool thing about symbolic execution, and that is, and I will be more precise with these terms later, but at the end of the symbolic execution and at the end of your symbolic debugging session, you will either get a counterexample that is like an undesired behavior, or you will get a proof, more precisely a reachability proof. But I will make this term I will precise it and refine it later. So, but that's a really strong claim that you get there. So, symbolic execution. Even if you've never heard of it, you all have a very, very good intuition of symbolic execution. Basically, whenever you're reading code and you're unknown code that you have not written yourself, or that you have written like half a year ago, or if you're doing a code review for a colleague, or you're doing an audit, then you're doing symbolic execution mentally in your head. Like, if I give you this program, and I give you this initial state with some of the variables assigned already, and I ask you to execute it, you can probably do it within 30 seconds and tell me the answer. And here's what your thought process will look like. So we have this initial state where we have some variables assigned to concrete values, like, for example, balance from is set to 100, and the balance of the to address is set to 200. So concrete values, concrete numbers. And then I say, okay, for these other parameters, like the value, the from address, and the to address, I don't tell you anything about it. I just leave them symbolic. And you can see we express unknown parameters as symbolic variables. These are the variables that are prefixed with a $sign. So that's our initial state. Now I ask you to execute this program from this initial state. So you go to the if statement, and you look at the condition, but you can see, well, I cannot really decide this condition yet because I don't know what the value is, right? So what you do mentally is you keep a note, and you first look at the then branch. but you keep a mental note, and you need to come back later to do the else branch as well. So you go to the then branch, and you see, like, if you're entering the then branch, then you know that the condition of the if statement must be satisfied. So you know that 100 is less than the value. That's what we call a path condition or a constraint that we collected during the execution. And then we execute the next statement, which is just a revert statement. So we are terminating execution. We say false, error state, go back. So now we're done. No, we are not, because we kept this mental note that we need to look at the else branch as well. So we descend into the else branch, and now we have a different path condition, right? Because we now know that the condition of the if statement must be false. So we know that 100 is greater than or equal to the value. So then I ask you to execute the next statement, you execute this balance of assignment, you update the storage, and you go to the next statement and do the same. So, and that was a really slow walkthrough of everything that's happening in your head when you're reading this code. You're doing this automatically, even without like me drawing this tree here. And that's essentially also what we do when we do audits, for example. Well, we need to look at the code and we want to cover all the possible branches, right? And this can become very tedious as the complexity of the programs grow. So that's why we came up with this symbolic debugger. In a way, you can think of it as a little tiny robot that's assisting you as you're reading code, and it's acting as your external memory. It's doing all the bookkeeping for you. It remembers all the branches that you have not visited yet. And you don't need to you don't need to remember all the contents of the variables because the debugger makes them inspectable to you, inspectable. So let's look at this example. And this is like kind of a textbook example of a super critical bug in a transfer function of an ERC20 token. And it looks like a textbook example, but this actually happens in the wild. We have seen this in audits. Specifically, this exact bug was found in a Code Arena audit before. Even if you don't see the bug right away in the transfer function, don't worry, that's why we have the debugger, and even better if you don't see the bug straight away, because then you will see the benefit of the symbolic debugger. So you see that debug button above the transfer function, that's how you launch a debugging session. You just click the button, there's zero configuration. And then the debugger automatically stops at the first line. So that's the time to set breakpoints typically. So I set a breakpoint here in line 32, and I hope this is all readable to you. I set a breakpoint here in line 32, and what I'm doing next is I'm going to virtually go to the breakpoint button, and I want to pay your attention to the bottom left corner. You see the call stack there. What happens next is you can see I've reached the breakpoint, but I actually hit it 2 times. I now have 2 different threads of execution. So you now might be wondering, threads? Well, Solidity is not a multi-threaded programming language, so where are threads coming from? And we use threads here to model the branches that we've seen before, like if, then, and else branches, while loops, etc. So threads here are different branches in execution. They are not concurrent, they are just different behaviors that the function could take. And I can tell you that one of these branches is behaving, well, correctly in a sense. It's doing no harm, and that's the branch that we are currently looking at. And the other branch is a witness of the critical bug that I talked to you before. So let's look at the contents of the variables, specifically the balances. Like we see that the balance of the message sender has decreased by value, by the amount of value that we send. And the balance of the to address has increased. That's perfectly fine. And now I want to show you, to draw your attention to this path condition number 15. That's a really weird way of like the EVM telling us that the message sender and the to address are two different addresses. Like that's our path constraint. So we are always assuming in this branch of execution that the paths are different. So now and this is a good branch. Now let's look at the other branch. Oh, sorry. Yeah, now we are looking at the other branch, and this is where things go sideways. And again, look at the balances. Like what happened to the balance of the message senders? It increased. And what happened to the message of the to address? It also increased. So we did a transfer, but instead of transferring tokens from one address to another address, suddenly two accounts have more value, like in their pocket. That's minting tokens out of thin air. And now look at the path condition. And this is now the opposite path, where it tells us, again, it's a really weird way of the EVM telling us, hey, I'm assuming that the message sender and the to address are the same address. So if we have this assumption that like I'm the message sender and I'm doing a transfer to myself, then I'm increasing my balance out of thin air. And I hope that you can see how the debugger like pinpoints you to the bug, because it automatically branches on this condition. So if you haven't kept it in, like, if you have forgotten about this edge case in your head, no worries, the debugger got your back. All right, some more cool stuff about the Symbolic debugger is we have full integration with Foundry. That is, you can execute Foundry tests. So you have symbolic testing. I don't know if you're familiar with Foundry, but it's basically a way of writing your property tests or unit tests in Solidity itself, and then when you execute the test, you will feed it with random parameters. What the Symbolic debugger does is it takes the same test, executes it, but instead of choosing random inputs for the parameters, we choose symbolic values for the parameters. And that's now really cool, because remember the thing that I said at the beginning, that you get a proof of something, and for example, in this case, you can get a proof that the assertion at the end of this function is always true. It's never going to be violated. Or you get a counterexample. That's the other case. Found a bug, even better. Like these control flow graphs, these branching structures, they can get really cumbersome once your contracts grow in complexity. So we also have this feature where we can render the control flow graph for you, and then you can select a node and load the state of the EVM or load the state of the Solidity program into the debugger. That's really cool visual aid that helps a lot. Like, make sure that you like put ticks on all the branches. Also, we have full support of EVM bytecode debugging. And I will give a workshop later at EVM Summit that's going to be recorded. So that will be basically a long version of this talk with more focus on the low-level details, like you can debug EVM bytecode. So a little bit on our background technology. So you've just seen Symbolic, which is a symbolic Solidity debugger. It's not built from scratch. Like, basically, all the symbolic execution, all the heavy stuff has been developed at our company years ago. Like, we have KVM, which is a form of semantics of the EVM, and it's complete. You can even use it to track the gas costs of every execution. And then we have control, which is the part that links our KVM to Foundry, so to say. And then there's another tool in our tool belt that's called ERCX, which is a conformance checking tool for ERC20 tokens, ERC4626 tokens. And we are working on an integration with the debugger so that if you have an ERC20 token, you can use ERCX to test your conformance with a standard specification. And if it finds like a violation, ERCX will then generate a counterexample for you that is, and with counterexample, I mean this piece of Solidity code that's on the slide here. So it will give you an executable counterexample, and then you can use the debugger to interactively replay what's going wrong with your token. So when will this be available? And so we are currently working on doing all the polishing, and eventually the first beta version of this Symbolic Solidity debugger will be part of our ERCX subscription service. Well, that's it from me. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, catch me outside. Yeah, thank you.